This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years with the BBC, Sky and ITN. For this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. For this edition, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its fifth week, what's been driving President Putin? What did he think he was going to achieve by launching his forces across the border? And what now might he settle for? I've been talking to Sir Tony Brenton. He was Britain's ambassador to Moscow between 2004 and 2008. He met Vladimir Putin several times and he had to deal with the Russia the president was creating. He can still recognize the man he knew then, but he also sees how much has changed.
Tony Brenton, thank you for talking to us for this purpose. Let's start with what is motivating Vladimir Putin. What is the problem in Putin's eyes that somehow an invasion of Ukraine is supposed to solve?
Well, there are two separate issues here, one of which goes back a long way and the other of which is a bee in Putin's own particular bonnet. The long-term one, the 30-year one, has been Russian grumbles, and this is not just Putin, this is also Yeltsin and indeed Gorbachev, about the expansion of NATO being seen in Russia as a security threat to them. Now, we regard that as nonsense. NATO is a defensive alliance and all that. I know a lot of securocrats. Anything bigger than them, they view as a danger. And NATO is very significantly bigger than Russia and is getting bigger. So over 30 years, they've complained about it. We've ignored their complaints and simply carried on expanding NATO. That's part of the background. The other part of the background, however, is, I won't say exclusively Putin, but it is central to Putin's vision of things, which is that, in effect, Ukraine ought not to be an independent country at all. There's a sort of slightly mystical pan-Slavic feeling that Belarus, Ukraine and Russia are the core of Slavism in some form. And it's an act of outrageous treachery, in a way, of Ukraine to contemplate going off and joining Russia's enemies. And that has come to a particular head over the last few months. Bunch of reasons. First of all, the Russians were suspicious that the Ukrainians were going to launch an assault on an area that we're defending in the Donbass in the extreme east of Ukraine, which they're currently fighting a small war in. Secondly, the arrival of the new Biden administration led the Russians to conclude that they were going to have problems with the Americans in any case and need to brace themselves for that. But thirdly, I think that COVID, which isolated Putin's been described as the longest self-isolating head of government in the world, has effectively isolated Putin for 2 years from anybody but a rather small group of tough nationalist guys whom I actually know a few of. And in the course of that time, he has brought to a really quite intense pitch his concern about Ukraine joining NATO, which has led us to where we are now.
We'll certainly come back to talking about the individual circumstances of Putin and what he's been through in the last couple of years and how that might have affected his judgment. But just to go back to some of the earlier points you made, we do hear this criticism that, if only the West and NATO had been more sensitive, maybe in the 90s, come up with a different sort of alliance, this could have been avoided. But at the same time, as you also allude to, Vladimir Putin, especially recently, has essentially said Ukraine's not a real country, should be part of Russia. If that's the case, would it actually have made any difference if we'd been more sensitive in the West, if in the end that is what he thinks?
Well, the reason that Putin they've got to where they are is that has been on the back, as I say, of this concern about the expansion of NATO. Putin, on that, has the absolute support of the entire Russian security establishment and indeed the Russian people to the extent that they think about it. The Ukraine thing is close to individual to him, I would say. But he's been able to ride on the back of that general concern about NATO's position and expansion to pursue his own particular obsession, which has led us to the war where we are now. So the two are very closely linked. And the main point is that, yes, we in the West, in NATO, made a huge mistake in going ahead with expansion, precisely because it's alienated Russia in the way that it has. But that in a way is water under the bridge and in no way justifies the Russian attack on Ukraine, which has just taken place, which is driven much more by Putin's personal obsession.
And it does deny to the sort of people of countries like Ukraine, if you start saying, well, we have to worry about Russia and how they will look on the expansion of NATO, does kind of deny to countries like Ukraine their own agency and their own right to say, actually, we're an independent country now, and this is what we would like to do.
Yes, that's right. And that's a difficult choice to make. But frankly, the choice that we in the West have faced, I mean, throughout this is, who are we worried about more? Poland, which is where a lot of this started, or Russia? This stage, who are we worried about more? Ukraine or Russia? And you know, I think the White House spokesman formulated this rather well a couple of days ago. Of course we care about Ukraine. Of course we will do everything we can to, you know, give it the choices that it wants and to support it in the very unpleasant war it's now fighting. But finally, the duty of the President of the United States is to worry about the security of the American people. Would going to war with Russia benefit that security or not? And Pasky said very clearly, no, obviously it wouldn't. There are things we can do for Ukraine, but giving it the choice to join NATO, which in any case is not a real choice because it's such a long way away from it, threatens us, or has threatened us, with precisely the war we now find is going on.
Just before we move on, just to sort of throw backwards again a little bit to sort of try and understand Putin's way of thinking. He's also talked about the end of the Soviet Union being, I can't remember the exact phrase, but being sort of the biggest disaster of
the biggest geopolitical disaster of our times or something. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. When, you know, I would say in a fairly crowded field in the last century, but yeah. that was his view. I mean, presumably restoring the Soviet Union, you know, in some form fits in with all the ideas we've talked about already about countries being in the orbit of Moscow and, you know, stopping the expansion of NATO. So it's all part of a piece.
Well, I was just listening to Liz Truss on the radio again this morning, saying that Putin's aim is to rebuild the Soviet Union. I say this with a certain amount of conscience, of caution, because I was wrong about Putin. I thought Putin would never contemplate the sort of military action that he's just taken. So I've been wrong in the past. But I do not believe that Putin is or has ever been about rebuilding the Soviet Union, because it's obviously such an inconceivable objective. Large chunks of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states, for example, are now in NATO. Other large chunks, if you look at the Stans in Central Asia and so on, have no intention of rejoining a renewed Soviet Union. So it's unrealistic. And indeed, in that speech where Putin said, this is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, or whatever it was he said, he then went on to say, those who don't feel that have no heart, but those who want to actually reverse it have no brain. So he himself acknowledged the impossibility of rebuilding the Soviet Union. Separate from that, as I've just said, this obsession with Slavic unity and the core Slavic states, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, is an attempt to partially reverse, if I can put it that way, the collapse of the Soviet Union back in 1991.
You were ambassador in Moscow in the 2000s. You met Vladimir Putin. I mean, when you met him, how did he come across to you? Was he a man at that stage, a leader that you thought, yeah, we could work with this guy?
He was slightly scary, really. He was always impeccably turned out. He always knew exactly what the meeting was about, unlike an awful lot of politicians I've dealt with, exactly what he wanted out of it. He spoke perfectly formulated Russian, beautiful, to make his points and to make his arguments. And he knew exactly the weak points on your side of the table that he should go for. But he was also, he was therefore very calculating, very driven. The thing that drives him, lots of people say he just wants more money. That's just not true. What drives him is the desire to make Russia great again, to coin a phrase. And in Russians' eyes, it's worth noting, he's done a lot to achieve that, although this war may well reverse all of that. So those are the things that drove him. But he was a risk taker when the risks were calculable and containable. For example, the war with Georgia, which the Georgians started actually, but he went quite a long way taking a risk in invading Georgia to demonstrate that small countries didn't do that to Russia. The seizure of Crimea in 2014, done very fast, very surreptitiously. At the end of it, yes, the West could impose some sanctions, but that was the limit of it. And, in a way, he got away with it. Similarly, the action to support President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, a major poke in the eye for Western policy in the Middle East at the time, done quickly, done with very limited Russian military involvement. And actually, again, he got away with it. Bashar al-Assad is still there. He was not the sort of man, the man I knew, was not the sort of man to take the very big unquantified risk which this major invasion of Ukraine amounts to. And my conclusion from that, and my defense in my wrongness in thinking he wouldn't do it, is that we're now dealing with a different Putin. We're now dealing with a Putin who's been isolated for, as I say, 2 years, an angrier Putin, because the West, even in the most recent rounds of negotiations, didn't respond to Russia's concerns about the expansion of NATO and so on. And a man who I think also has his own political legacy. in mind. He's now been president of Russia for more than 20 years. He has scope for going on for another 10 years if he decides to do it. But as he thinks about his place in history, I think he's reached the conclusion that the real historical thing that he could do is recreate that old Slavic unity, including Ukraine and Belarus.
I mean, from what you know about the way he's been living for the last couple of years, do you think, you hint at it there, that he's not the man you knew in the 2000s? Do you think that his personality, his outlook really has changed, partly because of the way he has lived in the last couple of years with COVID?
Let me say, first of all, I'm very dubious about the psychological theory of history, that you can interpret a man's deepest desires and then know how history's going to go. I mean, I watched Putin quite closely and saw quite a lot of him when I was ambassador. As I say, a different man, but not a totally different man. The Putin we're dealing with now is a calculator, is focused still on making Russia great again, has achieved total control over Russia in a way that he didn't entirely have it when I knew him. He's now much closer to being the dictator that we've always described him as than he was back then. But I think that, the isolation, the fact that the people, because he's dealing with very few people at the moment, a very small circle of people get through to him. The defense minister, the head of the intelligence agencies, one or two people of that sort, tough nationalists just like him. So he has been living for 2 years in what has in effect been a very small echo chamber where his nationalist obsessions have echoed off and been repeated by those of the people around him. And I think that has been a large part in bringing him to where he is now.
And you've hinted at this, is the fact that he seems to have taken a much bigger risk than the man that you used to know in the 2000s would have been prepared to take with this invasion. Is that because he thinks he's running out of time? I don't mean, maybe he is conscious of his own mortality, but he's running out of time to really leave that legacy.
Well, I wouldn't put it that strongly. I would say that he's become more and more determined over that time to do the thing which he really thinks he wants to do on behalf of Russia. But various people have said he's gone mad. I don't think he's gone mad, but he's become unbalanced on this particular issue. Although he wouldn't accept it as being unbalanced. This is what really matters, he says. This is what I've got to do. Do you think about Brexiteers back a few years ago? You could say they were unbalanced, or you could say they became obsessed with the one issue they thought really mattered. And that's, I think, is what's happened to him.
I mean, there's been some talk about, could he be toppled if the people in the establishment, in the security establishment, decide he's taken them down a blind alley? Again, from your experience and knowledge, do you think there is any realistic prospect of that happening?
I think for the moment, he's pretty safe. The Russian people, A, don't know what's going on, B, tend instinctively to support their leader when they're in periods of political difficulty. Think back to 1941 and Stalin, think back to 1812 and Napoleon. And C, actually, the control over the Russian people is pretty strong. So I don't think he has a problem with the people as a whole. I'm pretty sure there are doubts in the immediate circle around him. And we saw this. There was a big public meeting of the Security Council right at the beginning of the actions which have led to this war, where normally these things are very carefully orchestrated. People appear on television and say, President Putin is absolutely right, and this is absolutely the right policy, and so on and so forth. That's what didn't happen at this meeting. People came on television and looked shaky, didn't quite know their lines. There are obviously doubts in there. Now, for the moment, I'm pretty sure he can contain and manage all that. But if the war, as now seems likely, really bogs down and Russia finds itself in a few weeks' time, having taken some ground in Ukraine, but now stuck there with a ruined economy whose impact will be more and more felt by the Russian people, with the circulation of troops, more and more troops will go back to Russia and will talk to the people, and suddenly the people will begin to discover what's going on. And I think at that point, there is a rising threat of a challenge to Putin's rule. And at that point, his focus will turn to protecting himself rather than doing the externally dangerous things that he's been doing over the last few weeks.
Do you think the kind of economic pressure the West is trying to put on will have an impact? You mentioned the impact on the economy. Can I start first with the idea that, you can target people who are somehow close to Putin and this will influence him? From what you've said, he's very isolated. Do you think the sort of idea of sanctioning oligarchs who are close to him or might have some influence, do you think that really might impact on his decisions?
The oligarchs don't have any real influence anymore. The people who have influence are the people I've talked about, the heads of the agencies, the top generals. Oligarchs on the whole are not popular figures in Russia, are not really very popular figures with the regime, although the regime has to do business with them to keep the economy going. But in a way, it'll be rather welcome from the point of view of the regime to see a few oligarchs brought down a peg or two.
So this idea that, if you sanction Roman Abramovich, somehow that will work its way back to Putin, you think that is misguided?
No, I see no likelihood of that at all.
So what about the wider issue of pressure on the economy as a whole, pushing the Russian banks and companies out of the international system?
Well, inevitably that sooner or later is going to have an impact on, it's already having an impact in Russia. You can't go to McDonald's anymore. Your MasterCard doesn't work anymore, all of that. And that will be felt initially by the middle class and then obviously more widely. As I've said, the initial reaction of the Russian people to a crisis where the West is ganging up against them, as they view it, is we rally around and support the regime and take some discomfort. And they've taken a lot of discomfort in the course of their history. But sooner or later, I suspect, especially if the war inevitably will be presented to the Russian people when it's over as a great triumph. But as doubts creep in about that, as the economic pain begins to bite, so you can see the beginning of the seeds of a real challenge to Putin, whether from within the elite or more widely within the Russian people. And I think actually that is quite likely to be where we're going to find ourselves in a couple of months' time.
So if he is conscious of that, and maybe time being against him, what do you think at this stage he could take from the military action in Ukraine as a sort of minimum and say, declare victory? What do you think he could do?
Well, the obvious thing he can declare victory over is a clear agreement that Ukraine will not join NATO. That was the casus belli originally, as advertised. He's very likely, I think, to get that, which will be helpful to him. They're also going to pick up some territory in the southeast of Ukraine, and there'll then be a negotiation about what happens to that territory, which will be part of a much more complicated negotiation about what happens about sanctions, what happens about reparations, what happens about war crimes trials and all of that. And it is perfectly conceivable that they will end up retaining a chunk of southern Ukraine, which can also be represented as a success. And the other thing that Putin is pressing for is better protections for the Russian-speaking community in Ukraine. So there's a bunch of things there which would be presentable as a success. The question then becomes as whether that success is justified by the sacrifices, the inability to go to McDonald's and all that. I don't want to trivialize this, but finally the ordinary Russian person is going to feel day to day the consequences of what I suspect they will increasingly understand to have been, broadly speaking, even with a few successes, a failed war. Now the Kremlin, I know the Kremlin is a pretty macho place. The thing not to be in the Kremlin is a loser. And the moment that Putin begins to look like a loser, the problems for him in retaining power become very real.
So if he could, for instance, decide that those were the gains he could take away from this war and declare victory, as a diplomat now, with your more international hat on, if I can put it that way, and your less Russian hat, what did the West say to Zelensky quietly? Well, you better take these terms because the alternative is too horrible. But of course, it's up to you, President Zelensky. But do you think that's what would happen?
Yeah, I mean, it is up to Zelensky. And Zelensky at the moment is watching his country taking a big pounding. And the West is paying a bit of a price. Markets are in a complete mess. There's lots of so far unacknowledged losses out there as Russian bonds default, which is expected to happen over the next few weeks and all of that. Oil prices soar. So there is quite a widespread interest in getting the war to an end. And I think that will eventually begin to prevail. Nobody, you're not going to get anybody in the British government to get up to say to Zelensky, carry on fighting, even when Zelensky himself is looking for a conclusion. The trick is to offer Putin enough to stop.
Just to go back again now to Putin, I mean, you were talking about the pressure building on him. Is part of his thinking that if he's no longer in power, he's in trouble? He can't just retire quietly to a dacha and live out his days and people come to him and, he writes his memoirs. I mean, is that part of the thinking, do you think?
That's undoubtedly part of the thinking. He did, of course, back in 2008, in those days, a long time ago, it feels like now, you were allowed 2 successive presidential terms, and then you had to stand down. Putin was approaching the end of that. And what he did was he conducted a little competition between 2 of his sidekicks about who would take over from him. One looked as if he was going to get a bit above himself and therefore vanished from the competition. The second one, Medvedev, took over as president for 4 years, but Putin kept all of the lines of power very firmly in his own hands. You can't, as a retiring dictator, trust your successor to treat you decently if there's a decent benefit in throwing you to the wolves. It is said of Putin that one of the obsessive things he took to watching on video was Gaddafi, having fallen, being murdered by the mob who eventually got him, and saying to himself, I cannot let that happen to me.
So just to sum up, where do you think we might end up then? What is your best guess? I'm sorry to ask you to do the old crystal ball thing, but your best guess, looking at where we are now, where do you think we may end up with Ukraine?
I think the Russians are going to get stuck, are well on the way to getting stuck in the war, which is the key parameter. There will then be a deal. And I've set out what the possible components of such a deal will be. And then there will be quite a complicated, messy period where Russia adjusts to not having achieved its objectives, to a president who, as I say, there's a danger will be seen as a loser, to therefore, hopefully, a revived level of real politics in Russia, which pushes them in a decent direction. Meanwhile, we in the West now identified Russia as total enemy and are lining up to maintain the sanctions. I'm sure this will be pretty difficult to get sanctions. The great thing about sanctions is they're easy to impose and very difficult to lift, plus lots of extra arms expenditure and so on. And the other thing, which I haven't mentioned, is therefore a Russia much deeper in China's pocket than it already is, which is not a good development at all, really. So a world which in quite a lot of ways is not as good a world as the world we had a month ago.
And for the West, having to deal and assuming we're dealing with a Russia that is essentially potentially dangerous, at least quite hostile, almost going back to a mindset before 1990.
Yeah, and a Russia which has already threatened to use nuclear weapons and having lost this war, if that's how it comes to be seen, will be increasingly angry and ready to lash out as its conventional inferiority has been exposed again.
So, as you said, a world a bit less comfortable than the one maybe we've had for a generation.
Or even a lot less comfortable.
Well, Tony Brenton, thank you very much for talking to us, and really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tony Brenton, former ambassador to Moscow, with a sobering conclusion that whatever happens in Ukraine, the world is going to have to deal with a more dangerous Russia and a more unsettled global picture. If you have thoughts on this or other podcast ideas, you can email me at andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.